check some other stories on our political radar today. Senator-elect Doug Jones of Alabama, a Democrat, telling a talk show last night that by move on, he actually meant from the contentious race in Alabama, not from the issues that colored it.
I wasn't really talking about moving on from those allegations. I think the people of Alabama voted for me to put me up there to try to talk about health care and those issues. And I want to get in there to do those issues. But that doesn't by any stretch mean that I don't think that those issues and those women who have made those allegations aren't important. They are.
A little cleanup there from the senator-elect. And the man Jones beat in that Alabama Senate election, Roy Moore, still has not conceded. President Trump aboard Air Force One right now, headed to Florida, Mar-a-Lago, one of his properties. And look at this breakdown. Today will be the 106th day the president has spent at a Trump property, spread across his resorts and golf clubs in Florida, New Jersey, and Virginia. The Russian President Vladimir Putin describing the newly laid out Trump administration national security strategy today with one word: aggressive.
The USA, as you know, has recently presented their new national security strategy. And diplomatically speaking, if I can put it into words, it is of an attacking nature. And if we use military terms, it's no doubt aggressive. We need to take that into account in our practical work.
President Putin talking about what he calls violations of Cold War-era nuclear missile treaties. He says the military buildups in some NATO countries are a new threat to Russia. Trust me, those NATO countries see things the other way around. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, following through on her promise to take names after the United Nations voted overwhelmingly to condemn President Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. On Thursday, Haley sent more than 60 nations an invitation to a friendship reception at the White House in January. Among the list of those invited, 9 nations, including Israel, Togo, Honduras, who voted against the resolution, meaning voted with the United States. Nations that abstained or didn't cast a vote were also invited. Earlier this week, you might recall, the president suggested a vote against the United States could mean losing foreign aid. Interesting week for Ambassador Haley. What do we make of it?
Well, look, this is going to be one of the really interesting, it goes beyond Nikki Haley, but just watching what the reverberations are in 2018 of the foreign policy chits that this administration has sort of laid down in the first year. There's been a lot of destabilizing gestures made, and they haven't had an effect yet because these ripples take a while to reach the edge of the pond, I guess, to extend a weird metaphor. So, you know, in the Middle East, there's going to be continuing reaction to the move on Jerusalem. What effects does that have in 2018? The president's new national security strategy, very aggressive, as Putin said, toward Russia and China. What do they do to respond to it? The moves that he's made that have the NATO countries beefing up their own defenses because they don't necessarily think they can rely on the U.S. All of this, and of course the rhetoric with regard to North Korea. It's in 2018 that we're going to see, you know, does the U.S. follow through on some of the threats it has made? Does the president finally start that trade war he keeps wanting? What are going to be the concrete effects of all of these policies, that these things that the administration has sort of put in motion in the first year?
And words do have consequences. So if you look at the Jerusalem decision, number one, you had the vote at the United Nations yesterday, 128 countries voting in favor of a resolution that implicitly, the United States wasn't named, but it was a slap at President Trump's decision. 128 in favor, 9 against, 35 abstentions. The Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas says forget about it. Says he won't even talk to the Trump administration right now because the president has made this decision, which for years Jerusalem has been part of final status. Leave that to the end. Let it be settled directly between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But listen to the Prime Minister of Israel here. The Palestinians are mad. They say they won't even entertain conversations about a peace plan right now. Prime Minister Netanyahu says President Trump might be starting a trend.
We're now talking to several countries who are seriously considering now saying exactly the same thing as the United States and moving their embassies to Jerusalem.
Which countries? Or from what continents?
I could tell you that, but I won't because I want it to succeed, and I think there's a good chance it will.
It's interesting there because many people in this town who've worked on this issue for a long time essentially predicted, number one, they weren't getting anywhere with their peace process anyway. They don't see Abbas is not strong enough. Netanyahu, they don't think is interested enough at times. That this is a Trump administration essentially planting the flag with Bibi Netanyahu and saying that's our Israeli-Palestinian policy.
Yeah, I don't think the politics are cut and dry here domestically. I mean, there are people in both parties that support what the president did. Democrats are certainly divided about this. And I think that as if Netanyahu's right and it leads to a trend that suggests that there are more people on the United States side than what we saw at the UN yesterday, perhaps the president will have something to talk about. So I think this will take some time to play out, and I don't think it's really quite clear exactly how this will impact the political debate here at home, because people are sort of all over the map on this particular issue.
And I think in terms of the peace process, the Trump administration sort of felt like they had nothing to lose in this scenario. They sort of feel like they've seen presidents make this promise over and over again. They've failed to move the embassy because they don't want to disrupt the peace process, but then the peace process doesn't go anywhere anyway. And so while behind the scenes we may, have heard rumblings from the Jared Kushner wing that things were going great and they're making progress, Trump acknowledged publicly, look, we haven't really moved forward with this peace agreement anyway. We'll see how this impacts it. The White House couldn't say that it would improve things whatsoever, but I think they sort of felt like they were at a stalemate anyway, and so why not fulfill one of the president's campaign promises and see what happens next?
It's interesting you mentioned Kushner, because my colleague who covers the White House, she did a really amazing story right after this about how Jared Kushner made a calculation that he thought there would be some sort of knee-jerk reaction where people would, of course, be aghast and protesting, et cetera, in the Middle East. But he thought within a couple of weeks, people would, quote, get over it and move on and come back to the table for the peace negotiations. That has absolutely not happened, and I don't think it's going to happen. People are really ticked.
I don't know where he's been. I was going to say for the last 50 years. I don't think he's not old enough to have been free to ask that question, but I don't know where he's been for the last 25 years. If he thought the President of the United States could do what he just did about Jerusalem, people were going to protest for a week or three and then come back to the table. That's somebody who, shall we say, doesn't read the newspaper or the history books. We'll just leave it at that. But good luck. Up next, Steve Bannon calls himself an ally of the president, but read what he says. Listen to what he says. Friend or foe? Welcome back. For those of you not keeping count at home, it's been 4 months now since Steve Bannon left his job as the president's chief White House strategist. Now, Mr. Bannon says he's still the president's wingman, yet he's increasingly harsh in his assessments of both his former boss and many of those still in the West Wing inner circle. In a Vanity Fair profile, Gabe Sherman reports, quote, Bannon has remarked on the toll the office has taken on Trump, telling advisors his former boss has, quote, lost a step. Quote, he's like an 11-year-old child. Bannon joked to a friend in November. Now, Bannon's scorn for presidential son-in-law Jared Kushner is no secret. Still, this take on Kushner's campaign year meetings with Russians is scathing. Quote, he's taking meetings with the Russians to get additional stuff. This tells you everything about Jared. They were looking for the picture of Hillary Clinton taking the bag of cash from Putin. That's his maturity level. It's great theater, the Bannon-Kushner relationship, but let's come back to the Bannon-Trump relationship. He's lost a step. He's like an 11-year-old child. If I said those things about you, Molly Ball, would you think I was your wingman?
Well, look, I think everybody knows that Bannon is a trash talker, but this is not the first time there has been public conflict between him and Trump, right? Trump sort of dissed him on his way out the door, and in that article there are White House officials, talking trash right back at Bannon and saying that he's sort of a bitter, disgruntled employee, basically. And they were originally on opposite sides of the Alabama Senate race in the primary, working at cross purposes. And in that competition between Trump and Bannon, Bannon won. And so they are competing for the mantle of the leader of what Bannon sees as his, transnational populist nationalist movement. Whatever that means. But I still think that, this is what Bannon does. He likes to stir things up. He knows that he can say things that create controversy and get himself in the headlines and create more chaos. And that's ultimately his agenda.
Perhaps these anti-Bannon forces in the Republican Party in Washington could see this as an opportunity to exploit those Trump-Bannon divisions. This is what Mitch McConnell said earlier today about Bannon. He said, the political genius on display throwing away a Senate seat in the reddest seat in America is hard to ignore. That is referring to Alabama. He's trying to send a message to the president, don't listen to this guy, particularly when it comes to Senate races when Bannon may side with primary opponents.
Yeah.
Well, let's actually listen. Let's actually listen to Leader McConnell. No, because that's an interesting point. You're at the end of this year, you just lost this red state. And if you're Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan, you're saying, Mr. President, please listen to us, or please listen to people we like and don't listen to this guy. But we know the president still talks to Steve Bannon, still listens to him sometimes. Here's the leader.
Do you blame Steve Bannon for Doug Jones being elected in Alabama?
Well, let me just say this. The political genius on display throwing away a seat in the reddest state in America is hard to ignore.
It's one big happy Republican family, right?
Well, there are allies too, who of the presidents inside the White House who would agree with Mitch McConnell, and who have also made their concerns about Steve Bannon very evident, that they feel like his political advice at this point is not worth much, but also that he's trying to become sort of the voice that Trump was, that he's trying to take credit for the president's achievements, for the president's populist appeal. And there are a lot of Trump loyalists inside and outside the White House that that's not sitting very well with.
You got to wonder if part of the reason, he participated in this profile and that this ran now is to sort of change the narrative, because everybody is talking about how Steve Bannon was the reason they lost Alabama, he's terrible for the Republican Party, and then this profile comes out and he's floating the idea that maybe he would run for president, which we were just talking about in the break, would probably never happen, but at least it gets people talking.
To borrow a phrase from my favorite football coach, we're on to 2018. Thanks for joining us at Inside Politics. See you back here Sunday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern, Christmas Eve. Come join us. We'll put her in the chair after a quick break.
Booking a flight at the last minute doesn't have to be
Welcome back. The former FBI Director James Comey getting what you might call an early Christmas gift from the halls of Capitol Hill. Sources tell CNN the Deputy FBI Director, Andrew McCabe, told congressional investigators behind closed doors that Comey did inform him of conversations he'd had with President Trump soon after those conversations happened. Over the course of 16 hours in front of 3 House committees, McCabe's testimony suggests he could corroborate Comey's claim that President Trump asked him early on for a pledge of loyalty. President Trump, of course, has strongly disputed that account, which is central to the question the special counsel is now exploring, whether the president's decision to fire Comey was part of an effort to obstruct justice. And speaking of the House investigations, the Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi says she's worried about the state of those probes, sending this letter to the Republican Speaker Paul Ryan. Quote, Democrats are deeply concerned by the majority's efforts to curtail the House Intelligence Committee investigation and its overall failure to address Russia's meddling in the 2016 election. We expect you will take urgent action to ensure this investigation can continue and justice can be pursued unhindered. Back into the room. Manu, let's start. You're part of the reporting on Deputy Director McCabe. We're told it was contentious behind closed doors. Republicans want to get at him. They think he was biased toward Hillary Clinton and against Trump. Let's get to that in a minute. In terms of backing up Comey, how significant is that going forward?
It could be very significant because as this investigation, the Mueller probe goes forward, undoubtedly he's going to try to figure out what Comey said to other people after these conversations allegedly took place. The president has disputed having these conversations with Comey, even suggesting, according to Comey's public testimony, that he urged him to back off the Michael Flynn investigation, that he asked for this pledge of loyalty, which the president has disputed on several occasions. But here is Andrew McCabe, the deputy director, under oath to the House Intelligence Committee earlier this week, asked specifically about this, said that, yes, the Comey did tell me that soon after they occurred. So Comey gave his contemporaneous account to McCabe. Now, we do also know that Comey has said publicly that there have been multiple people that he has informed about this. So there are other people, presumably, that also could back up Comey's account. So there could be more than one person saying that what Comey said at least was accurate at that time. We'll see if the president agrees to say the same thing under oath or say the opposite.
That would be interesting if we get to the point, and we expect to get to a point where the president is interviewed by the special counsel. He says it didn't happen, but you have Comey, McCabe, several others with years of experience in law enforcement. Comey took contemporaneous notes, briefed people right away, knew what he was doing, went and told other people so that it was on the official record. That's how you build a case against somebody. Well, let's move on to the other issue. I was watching another network last night that I often refer to as State TV here, and they weren't touching that part of the story because of who it involves, but they were saying that McCabe is one of these people who they view as tainted, and they're working behind closed doors. If the Republicans have a case, if they have a case that whether it's Deputy Director McCabe or other people at the FBI, not sending a few foolish text messages, but we're actually working with bias, will they hold a public hearing, or will they just have behind closed door meetings and then come out and throw innuendo at people who've given 10, 20, 30 years of their lives to law enforcement?
Public hearings, for sure, I do believe. Devin Nunes, watch him, the House Intelligence Chairman. He's a Trump loyalist, and he's been, we reported out this week, he started this sort of secret investigation beyond only his committee's investigation. It's an investigation specifically aimed at looking at criminal actions in the FBI. Now, there are a lot of Republicans who are very uncomfortable with this. It has created this divide in the House about whether or not, trying to discredit this investigation is going too far in making people question a law enforcement agency that is one of the most respected in the country. But I think that Nunes, is a dog with a bone right now, and they really are trying to make a point to try to discredit these folks in order to protect Trump.
Just saying you're investigating to the base of the Republican Party undermines their confidence. The chairman is investigating. It undermines public confidence in the institution. My point is, if they have something, bring it out in the public. If they have something, well, then we should see it. But if they're just trying to change the subject with behind closed door hearings and then innuendo, that's reckless.
Well, that is really the question: is this just an attempt to delegitimize, to muddy the waters, and to create confusion? And that's, you see, as you mentioned, the echo chamber of right-wing media really presenting this one-sided portrait. And so that is much more about persuading the public rather than coming up with a matter that Congress could investigate and do something about. It really is just about convincing the public that there's nothing to see here.
And to the point, it works. It works. Speaker Pelosi writes that she wants the House investigation to continue. I think the Senate investigation, the Intelligence Committee, tends to have more credibility in town among people in all parties. But the investigation that counts is the special counsel, Robert Mueller. He's actually operating in the court system. And look at our new poll. The Russia investigation is a serious matter or an effort to discredit Trump. 93% of Democrats say it's a serious matter. 78% of Republicans say it's an effort to discredit Trump. So this attacking the institutions and the investigators and the prosecutors works.
Well, yeah, it absolutely works. I mean, it worked during the Clinton era, too. You saw how effective that was and how Ken Starr Report appeared to be a political document when it came out. I think that it's easy for Republicans to try to follow this sort of same playbook. There are broader concerns about what this does to the fabric of American society when you're trying to undermine an institution like the FBI. So I think that is a broader concern and part of what's driving this divide right now, the concern about what Nunes is doing, even among Republicans. But, you're right. Look, the House could continue. They could close their investigation early. They could reach their own conclusion. But what matters ultimately is what Mueller finds. And I think it will still be difficult for serious Republicans in town to completely dismiss that, even if their base may sort of believe that this is all just a joke.
It expects next year House Republicans in particular to focus on the Clinton email investigation, which was why McCabe was behind closed doors with the two joint committees yesterday, asked about how they handled it. They believe it was not handled properly. They believe what he said gave them fuel to their concerns that she was treated favorably as a candidate, which is why she was not charged. That's going to be a big focus for them next year. So these investigations will probably, at least in the House, occur along partisan lines and probably shape the narrative heading into 2018.
I would also say watch Republican leadership both in the House and the Senate, Ryan and McConnell, also Senator Burr, potentially Trey Gowdy, who's a former prosecutor himself. If these figures start to agree with Devin Nunes and go into that direction, then, this could be a potential problem. But I don't think you see those types of members right now doing anything like that. So right now, this two sort of dynamics will be interesting, I guess.
It's a great point, because when they come back, it will be an even-numbered year and an election year. And sometimes that influences behavior in Washington, D.C. It's a shocking thing that happens from time to time. It's true. There's gambling in the casino. Up next, why the former CIA chief, John Brennan, says some of the president's remarks mirror those of a narcissistic, vengeful autocrat. Welcome back. Congressional Republicans made a tactical choice this week. Celebrate now and suffer later. By choosing to keep the government open, the Republicans gave themselves a Christmas present, a prolonged victory lap on tax reform. But they've set the stage for a rude return to Washington early in the new year, a long laundry list of unresolved issues with a history of cracking the veneer of Republican unity. Look at it, their spending issues, more spending issues, immigration issues, government surveillance authorities. Republicans know they're walking straight into quicksand, and the pessimism, quite palpable. Listen here, the Freedom Caucus chair, Mark Meadows, sounds somber already, telling this to the Wall Street Journal. I'm not optimistic. There'll be a whole lot of conservative wins in the month of January. And that was a conscious decision. Let's get our tax cut bill and celebrate. Let's do, as you just noted in the last block, a 3 or 4 week, keep the government spending open. That's not exactly your government at work. But when they walk back in an election year, the Republican Party, right out of the box, is going to have to deal with immigration, the so-called dreamer fix, spending levels, deficits, children's health care funding. The president again today in the White House saying we have to come back at fixing maybe Obamacare. not exactly what conservatives want to do anytime, let alone election year.
Yeah, it's hard to see, even if they get these bipartisan deals and if it becomes law, that you'll see that kind of ceremony we saw earlier this week where every Republican were hanging out in the White House praising the president for this deal. The party's going to be divided over these things. They're going to be divided over a fix to deal with DACA. It's a huge issue among conservative voters in particular. They're going to come back. They're going to have to deal with a lot of these things. And as Rachel noted earlier, this is going to distract from the big victory they have on tax reform, given all the mess they're going to have to deal with. And who knows what will happen. Maybe there could be even a government shutdown, which would be even worse for them politically. So there's a lot on their table they got to deal with.
Can I say, though, that quote from Mark Meadows is really interesting to me because, in a way, the best case scenario for the House Republicans is that the Freedom Caucus, led by Mark Meadows, is resigned to not winning a lot of these battles. If they are, in fact, signaling that they are willing to play ball and compromise and not put up a fight, if the conservative wing is willing to go along with the majority of the House caucus and the moderate and even sort of liberal Republican members, that makes things a lot easier for Paul Ryan. You know, the problem is if the conservatives put up a big fuss, as they did a lot when a Democrat was in the White House, a little bit less so with the Republican in the White House. So, you know, on these spending things and certainly on immigration, it's going to be, do conservatives put up a big fight against these things that leadership wants to do or not?
It's a fascinating point because when we get into 2018, again, we're going to have a lot of national conversations and some of them are frankly useless. You have to look at a map of congressional races and where are the contested congressional races. And if you're a suburban Republican who needs moderate Republican votes and you watched what happened in New Jersey, Virginia, and even Alabama, you're saying, let's do DACA, let's do children's health care funding, let's move toward the center, if you will. If you're a southern Republican or a more conservative rural Republican, the DACA fix is amnesty. That's what you've been telling your voters forever. And do you want to demoralize the Republican base, your conservative base, heading into a midterm election year? That's the challenge they're going to have on every one of these issues. There are some Republicans in one place, other Republicans in another place. The question is, does this happy Republican Party, after cutting taxes, turn back into the chaos party?
Yes. I think January is going to be particularly ugly in the House, where the conference is really divided. I think a majority of the House Republicans do want to tackle these issues or, take a hard line on DACA. Do not raise spending without making some sort of offsets. And they think that if they do this, they will sort of rally the base and say, we stuck it to Democrats and, that will help them in 2018. But there are a lot of swing state Republicans in the House and a bunch of senators who say this is just not realistic. Also, the Senate majority is now is going to be 51 members. I don't see how they do anything like entitlement reform, things that they would really make the base happy. They're going to have to move to bipartisanship.
Well, on that point, Speaker Ryan says, we're going to do entitlement reform. We're going to talk about welfare reform, Medicare reform, maybe Medicaid reforms. Listen here, the Senate. Now, remember, these House members, most of them come from relatively safe. A lot of them will be on the ballot next year, but 500,000 people, 600,000 people in an area, the line's drawn mostly by favorable Republican legislatures. Senators have to run statewide. Paul Ryan says we'll do entitlements. Mitch McConnell says,
Here's my only observation about entitlement reform. I've been here a while, and the only time we've been able to do that has been on a bipartisan basis. And it was a long time ago. The Speaker and the President and I are going to talk about this whole area in a couple of weeks, and we'll have more to say about what the agenda is then.
In other words, I'm not doing entitlements. I'm not making my guys and gals who have tough elections next year cast a vote on entitlement reform if they have to run statewide in a place like Nevada you mentioned earlier. But a lot of this in the House will be, maybe this is overly snarky, but theater, right? If you're a House member, you want to go home and say, I voted for it. Even if it doesn't pass, you want to go home and say, I voted for these things.
Sure, and of course, you can have the debate. There's nothing wrong with having the debate. There's nothing wrong with having the vote. But the notion that somehow they are going to get entitlement reform under a president who has vowed not to touch entitlements with a 51-vote majority in the Senate and with Democrats who have no inclination to participate in bipartisanship on something like that, it's a pipe dream. And that's a great thing for Paul Ryan to stick around for and try to fight for. We know it's one of his own personal passions and maybe a reason for him to stick around as House Speaker longer than he would otherwise, but come on.
But pressure on Democrats, who hate to interrupt, but I just want to get this in the block. Pressure on Democrats too, though. Listen to Nancy Pelosi here. Democrats promised, the president opened the possibility of doing this Dreamer deal, to let the Dreamers stay, give them some sort of legal status. They thought they were going to get a deal with the president this year. Democrats promised that to their base, but
I fully intend that we will not leave here without the DREAM Act passing, with a DACA fix. And I've made that very clear.
The President's been insisting that the DACA issue be addressed this year, and this is the last week.
Well, this is the last year of that they kicked the can down to for the omnibus into January. It's this year extended. That's what it is.
She's just trying to this year extend it, wave it off, but the progressive base is furious.
This is a real,
and they want results just like Republicans. They want results quickly in the new year.
It's a real problem. I mean, Pelosi and her Democratic caucus did not vote for the short-term spending bill because they did want DACA included in this bill that kept the government open. But Senate Democrats were split on that, particularly Democrats who wanted to not be tagged with voting for a government shutdown effectively by opposing the spending bill. So this is going to be a real issue for them, especially if they get a bipartisan deal in the Senate. You could presume that that's not going to satisfy a lot of these progressives in the House. It's going to require some consensus, and there's been no consensus on this issue.
One of the big questions, what does the president want? Border wall funding, what else? What do Democrats have to give to get? Will be a big question early on. Up next for us, a past bombshell in the Russia investigation gets some new attention.
Monica, it is absolutely...
Welcome to Inside Politics. I'm John King. Thank you for sharing your day with us. It's off to Mar-a-Lago for Christmas. The president says big infrastructure spending is his big New Year's resolution, and he predicts, unlike 2017, there will be bipartisan dealing. Plus, friend or foe, the president's United Nations ambassador says she's making a list and checking the votes. And it's official. The president signed the big Republican tax cut plan today. It also repeals the Obamacare coverage mandate, adding this 2018 election year challenge for the president's party.
Obamacare, essentially, I think it ultimately leads to the end of Obamacare. It's essentially, I think Obamacare is over because of that, and we're going to come up with something that's really going to be very good. Many people thought it should have been overturned in the Supreme Court. Didn't quite make it, almost, but didn't quite make it. But now we're overturning the individual mandate, most unpopular thing in Obamacare.
We begin the hour with the president's big year-end achievement. Tax reform is done. The president signing it into law just moments ago without the hoopla you might expect for what Republicans consider their 2017 legislative crown jewel. But the president had an explanation.
I watched the news this morning and they were all saying, will he keep his promise? Will he sign it by Christmas? You were one. But will he sign it by Christmas? And I called downstairs. I said, get it ready. We have to sign it now. We were going to wait till January 7th or 8th and do a big formal ceremony. But every one of the networks was saying, will he keep his promise? Will he sign it for Christmas, before Christmas? And so I immediately called. I said, let's get it ready.
The president happy there to paint himself as a man of action after a curiously quiet morning from the White House about how this would all play out. Just 15 minutes before he was scheduled to fly off to Mar-a-Lago for the Christmas holiday, without the normal trappings of a big historic signing ceremony, without, for example, Speaker Ryan, Leader McConnell behind him, and with the stage to himself, the president put pen to paper and saluted what he says is this bill's greatness.
This is the bill right here, and we're very proud of it. It's going to be a tremendous thing for the American people. It's going to be fantastic for the economy. And I consider this very much a bill for the middle class and a bill for jobs. And jobs are produced through companies and corporations, and you see that happening. Corporations are literally going wild over this, I think even beyond my expectation.
In the Oval Office there and a bit earlier on Twitter, the president making clear he doesn't think he's getting enough credit for what he views as a pretty big first year in office.
The country's doing very well. We've tremendously cut regulations, legislative approvals, for which I'm given no credit in the mainstream media. We have, I believe it's 88, which is #1 in the history of our country. Second now is Harry Truman. Harry Truman had more legislative approvals than any other president, and a record long held. And we beat him on legislative approvals, for which I get no credit. We have more legislative victories than any other president, not including this, but this is the capper, because this is, again, the biggest tax cut, biggest reform of all time.
It's a big day. With us to share their reporting and their insights, CNN's Sarah Murray, Times' Molly Ball, CNN's Manu Raju, and Politico's Rachel Bade. Let's start with that moment and then expand out to what it means for the bigger moment, the end of the year, the president off to spend his holiday. Why did they do it this way? Why not a big signing ceremony? The president says he watched the news. He could have scheduled this differently.
He certainly could have scheduled it differently. It was actually funny, you know, normally you would be with Leader McConnell, you would be with House Speaker Ryan, and you would be signing the bill and maybe offering them pens. He actually offered the pens to members of the media who were in the room because he didn't have his partners in this legislating process with him. It was a bizarre kind of a way to do this, but I think the president clearly wanted to get this done before he left for Florida. It also seemed like an opportunity, to be honest, to dodge questions from the press. Part of sort of the hubbub of the last few days was whether he would do a press conference along with the signing of this legislation. So by doing it in a sort of a quieter way in the Oval Office, inviting just the small pool of reporters in, he avoided kind of this broader scene with the press conference, which is something the White House had been toying with doing.
So from beginning of the year to the end of the year, we're not quite done yet. The president will have an active week, I'm sure, on social media, if nowhere else, while he's in Mar-a-Lago. But he's different. He's different. He could have also, you mentioned he could have had a big signing ceremony at the White House. He could have also gone out to a small business somewhere in the country and tried to make the case that this is good for America.
Well, it seems so typical of this president, right? The impulsiveness, the spontaneity, the short-term thinking, and being extremely reactive to what he just saw on TV. I mean, he is being actually extremely honest with us and with the American people, saying, I saw something on TV, it bugged me, darn it, we're going to do it now. And like, I think that was literally his thought process. Now, as you mentioned, it also meant that that he did it alone. He didn't share credit with anybody. And to the extent that Republican leaders on the Hill felt that this was their achievement too, they did all the heavy lifting, and then they don't get to stand there with the president while he signs the legislation that's the result of all their hard work. I think there may be some grumbling about that.
John, you make a key point about why they need to go out into the country and sell this. I mean, that is going to be the challenge come 2018. They're going to have to sell this to the American public, explain why this major legislative victory actually means a lot, could help voters, because their success in the majority, in a lot of ways, this is going to be the one thing that they are campaigning on. They got this done. They have to convince a very skeptical American public that this is good for them and convince them to keep them in power right now, because as we know, things are not looking good for them come 2018. This is the one thing they have to sell. And if this one way he could have done it is going into the country and selling it that way.
And I'm just going to go out on a limb here and say the president not only needs to sell this to the country, but there's also members of his own party on the Hill who are already losing this sort of euphoria that they were feeling on Wednesday. I was speaking yesterday to Tom Rooney when they passed this short-term government funding bill for 3 weeks, just a day after, this ceremony at the White House on the tax bill. And he was fuming. He was saying, this is the epitome of a government that does not work. We are here cheering a 3-week government funding bill. How is this an achievement? They didn't pass disaster. They didn't deal with DACA. They didn't do a spending deal. So I think that the president also has to be talking to his own party and reminding them, guys, let's talk about this, instead of fuming about some other things.
And so you hear the president's frustration. And if you're a Trump supporter out there, you blame us in the media for some of this, and maybe you blame something else. If you're a Trump critic, you think he's just full of hyperbole and he really hasn't done much. I'm sorry, Mr. President, your record does not match up to Harry Truman. A lot of those were big legislative victories. You have one signature achievement, the tax cut plan, unless you consider the Russia sanctions bill. That was the other major piece of legislation, but the president doesn't like that bill.
It's not been implemented yet.
They're slow walking the implementation. That's true. But what about the moment? He thinks, and they have done a lot from a regulatory standpoint. He did get a Supreme Court justice. He did set a record at lower federal court judges being appointed. Now he has his big tax cut, and yet he goes to Mar-a-Lago as the least popular first-term president in the history of polling.
This is one of the things that's been extremely frustrating to him personally, this notion that he doesn't get credit for what he's achieved so far, but also the notion that he ran on a guy who is going to improve economic opportunity. He sort of looks at his campaign as, we talked a lot about immigration, but we talked about improving economic opportunity for Americans. And so when he looks at the jobs numbers, when he looks at GDP, when he looks at where the stock market is at, and when he looks at passing tax reform and reducing regulations, he says, I have had an extremely successful year on that part of the promises I've made. Why am I not getting credit in the media? Why am I not getting credit in Washington? And why don't people love me? And the reality is that people have been unable to set aside some of their more visceral feelings about the president, about his style, about the way he behaves, about the things he has said about people, to sort of embrace those economic accomplishments, and they are good economic numbers in the way that we would expect from a traditional president. Traditionally, if a president is looking at jobs numbers like this, at economic data like like this, they're sitting pretty well. And that's just not true of Trump.
And it's a great point because it's almost the flip side of what we went through early in the Obama administration, in the sense that a lot of the policy proposals were not popular with the public, but the president was personally popular. People liked him, so his numbers stayed up. With President Trump, they don't like him. And so anything with his name on it polls poorly. This Democratic pollster, Peter Hart, one of the smartest people in the business, wrote this in a year-end memo. He helps with, the Democratic and the Democrat-Republican partnership on the NBC Wall Street Journal poll, did a ton of focus groups across the country this year with voters. He writes this: Donald Trump lost the support and respect of a majority of Americans in his first year as president. In 2017, Americans hoped the Trump era would be about changing Washington and the old established order, but they did not sign on to the division and discord. Instead, 2017 has found Americans feeling that they are living constantly on edge. Instead of being a unifying force or a stable leader, he has been an unnerving presence. That's a harsh verdict. Now, Peter's a Democrat, but when he writes these things, he's looking at the data, and he's giving a pretty straightforward assessment there. Ouch.
Well, and I think that is what you see. I mean, that's what I hear talking to people around the country, and that's what you see in a lot of these polls, that despite the economic stability, people really feel the sense of uncertainty. There's a huge number of Americans who feel that the country is on the wrong track. That number has increased since the election. It hasn't gone down. A huge majority of Americans feel that the president is dividing the country rather than bringing the country together. And we see Trump's support softening even as the opposition to him hardens. That strong disapproval number in some polls over 50%. That's really remarkable. And so, you know, people are not able to ignore the ways that the president behaves. And you know, given that the president is the one in charge of his behavior, I'm not sure why he would expect them to.
And he hasn't really done much to try to bring the country together. In fact, he's gone after his opponents when they've come after him in rather stark terms. In the legislative achievements that have occurred are ones that his base loves. And one reason why they've been very happy with him, he's still 30 to 35, 36% of hardcore supporters. Judicial nominees, that's loved by the conservative base. Getting Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court, loved by the conservative base. This tax reform bill is something that the core constituency appreciates as well. So what he has accomplished has done well for his core supporters, but to the middle of the country, the folks who are in the middle who are not Democrats, not liberals, those independent voters, they're not sold yet.
But do we know, as he goes off for Christmas, reflecting, he's got another month in his first year, but he goes off the holidays to reflect, assuming he does reflect, are there lessons learned? You see, Speaker Ryan says he thought he learned a lesson in the tax cut debate, that he stayed out of the minutia. During the Obamacare debate, the president on several occasions sent things off the rails a little bit by getting involved when the leaders didn't want him to get involved, or getting involved in a way the leaders didn't want him to get involved. Did he learn that lesson, how to be a better deal maker, a better legislator? And more importantly, you see all these recounts today in Politico, in the New York Times, and elsewhere about this contentious meeting with the White House political team about how to handle this going into 2018. What should the strategy be? How much should the president travel? They're still having a lot of backstabbing and infighting.
I would say from the Hill standpoint, I've heard Republicans give him compliments in terms of how lessons learned on legislation on the tax bill in particular. He tried to take a more aggressive approach in terms of campaigning and talking about the tax bill around the country. And he didn't do a lot of attacking when he heard people were not going to vote for this bill. Instead, he tried to get them to come around. Senator Corker eventually came around. The way he worked with Susan Collins was particularly interesting, a moderate who obviously had problems with the Obamacare repeal bill. He wasn't attacking her. Instead, the White House worked with her and said, listen, if you vote for this tax bill, we're going to back the idea of propping up the Obamacare subsidies next year. So that was more of a cooperation approach, it seemed like, with the tax bill.
It's going to be fascinating to see how Trump goes on the campaign trail, decides which races, particularly on the Senate side, he thinks he'll be valuable. The candidates will think he's valuable. People like Dean Heller in Nevada, who needs Trump presumably to get out of the primary, but Trump could be a significant liability in a general election. How do you balance that? That's going to be a remarkable thing for the White House to decide on how to deploy Trump.
Right, and that's the perfect segue. Up next, the president touts what he's got done in 2017, but Congress has a lot on its plate early next year. The Republicans want to get an early start, maybe meet with the president over the holidays.
Do you have any plans to visit Mar-a-Lago over the holidays?
No. The closest I'm going to a bowl game in Jacksonville.
For millions of baby boomers.
And they were ignored by the president. Tell us more about that. Yeah, absolutely. So during the final days of the Alabama Senate race, this is back when Donald Trump was still considering whether to go all in on Roy Moore. He was sort of going back and forth on it. And you had the Republican National Committee chairwoman, Ronna Romney McDaniel, basically go to White House Chief of Staff John Kelly and produced for him a two-page memo which showed how under Trump the GOP was support among women voters was plummeting. They're basically showing how fast the Republican Party was falling and essentially warning him that a full-fledged Trump endorsement of Roy Moore would further damage the party's standing with women. And it was a warning that, as you said, went unheeded. Trump went all in for Roy Moore, and we all know what happened next. Moore lost, and there's a lot of concern right now heading into 2018. The Republicans are really struggling with women voters, and that could turn against them next year at the ballot box.
As everybody's trying to figure out what that strategy is for 2018, Amy, you also have some reporting on Hillary Clinton and how she may or may not be used, sort of the cost-benefit analysis that's being done. Is there also a conversation that needs to be had with Hillary Clinton? And are there people perhaps among establishment Democrats who are not getting the message in the same way that maybe it is time for Hillary Clinton to step aside?
Yeah, so there's kind of this push-pull happening. A lot of people want her in. They think that she could be beneficial and helpful in their districts, particularly if she won those in 16. And so they're kind of encouraging her to come in and help out. But there are a lot of people that I talked to, a lot of Democrats, even Democrats that supported her, that are saying, please don't. This is a time to kind of clear the decks, bring in new, fresh blood. This is what we need as a party. We don't need Barack Obama. We don't need Hillary Clinton. And I think you're hearing a lot of that coming from both sides. So there's, and there's no leader of the Democratic Party right now. So they're looking for someone to kind of fill that void, and that's really hard for them.
And that's the source that we've been talking about for some time, actually, in terms of filling that void. Also in terms of whether or not the people at the top of the party, if there is one, and of course in this case it's the president, are helpful. David, also in Alex's piece, Charlie Dent noting that the president should be, in his words, very discreet and selective about where he campaigns. Is that message, David, getting through at the White House?
Well, we'll see when we see the president's travel schedule next year. What's going to be really interesting, and this is obviously not the first time, we saw Barack Obama deal with this in 2010. His numbers weren't great, and how Democrats navigated using him or not in advance of the sort of bloodbath they had there. The same thing with George W. Bush in 2006. But Donald Trump is even lower right now, and so how Donald Trump reacts to Republicans who say thanks but no thanks, Mr. President, is going to be a fascinating storyline to watch in 2018. This is not a president who likes to be rebuffed. He's got a pretty sensitive ego about these things. And so how watching him deal with how his party navigates his low numbers if they don't improve will be critical to how the Trump political operation deals with 2018.
It will be also fascinating to see how much of that is actually made public and how much we learn about that. Rebecca, the president also tweeting this morning about that he envisions some bipartisan work ahead in 2018, and it could begin with infrastructure. Are you hearing about an appetite for that?
Well, that's a rosy view of things, I would say, Erica. There might be an appetite on behalf of the president. Mitch McConnell has also said he wants to see things get done on a bipartisan basis in 2018 if they're going to get anything done at all. But there are a few things working against the president in this respect. First of all, it's an election year, and lawmakers don't tend to like to do tough things in an election year. And so even in something like infrastructure, you're talking about government spending that might be running up the deficit potentially. And so that could be a tough sell for many Republicans in a tough election year for them. But also, I think what we saw with tax reform, for example, is even some of these vulnerable Democrats in red states, running in states where Trump won in 2016, they didn't have an appetite to work with Republicans. They feel like they are in a very strong position politically. The president is unpopular. Republicans are unpopular. Their policies are unpopular. So politically, there isn't this great incentive for Democrats to work with Republicans. In fact, the incentive...
The 13 pounds and 7 inches overall in your first month. Lose weight fast. Money back guaranteed.
Check some other stories on our political radar today. Senator-elect Doug Jones of Alabama, a Democrat, telling a talk show last night that by move on, he actually meant from the contentious race in Alabama, not from the issues that colored it.
wasn't really talking about moving on from those allegations. I think the people of Alabama voted for me to put me up there to try to talk about health care and those issues. And I want to get in there to do those issues. But that doesn't by any stretch mean that I don't think that those issues and those women who have made those allegations aren't important. They are.
A little cleanup there from the senator-elect. And the man Jones beat in that Alabama Senate election, Roy Moore, still has not conceded. President Trump aboard Air Force One right now, headed to Florida, Mar-a-Lago, one of his properties. And look at this breakdown. Today will be the 106th day the president has spent at a Trump property, spread across his resorts and golf clubs in Florida, New Jersey, and Virginia. The Russian President Vladimir Putin describing the newly laid out Trump administration national security strategy today with one word: aggressive.
The USA, as you know, has recently presented their new national security strategy. And diplomatically speaking, if I can put it into words, it is of an attacking nature. And if we use military terms, it's no doubt aggressive. We need to take that into account in our practical work.
President Putin talking about what he calls violations of Cold War-era nuclear missile treaties. He says the military buildups in some NATO countries are a new threat to Russia. Trust me, those NATO countries see things the other way around. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, following through on her promise to take names after the United Nations voted overwhelmingly to condemn President Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. On Thursday, Haley sent more than 60 nations an invitation to a friendship reception at the White House in January. Among the list of those invited, 9 nations, including Israel, Togo, Honduras, who voted against the resolution, meaning voted with the United States. Nations that abstained or didn't cast a vote were also invited. Earlier this week, you might recall the president suggested a vote against the United States could mean losing foreign aid. Interesting week for Ambassador Haley. What do we make of it?
Well, look, this is going to be one of the really interesting, it goes beyond Nikki Haley, but just watching what the reverberations are in 2018 of the foreign policy chits that this administration has sort of laid down in the first year. There's been a lot of destabilizing gestures made, and they haven't had an effect yet because these ripples take a while to reach the edge of the pond, I guess, to extend a weird metaphor. So, you know, in the Middle East, there's going to be continuing reaction to the move on Jerusalem. What effects does that have in 2018? The president's new national security strategy, very aggressive, as Putin said, toward Russia and China. What do they do to respond to it? The moves that he's made that have the NATO countries beefing up their own defenses because they don't necessarily think they can rely on the U.S. All of this, and of course the rhetoric with regard to North Korea. It's in 2018 that we're going to see, you know, does the U.S. follow through on some of the threats it has made? Does the president finally start that trade war he keeps wanting? What are going to be the concrete effects of all of these policies, that these things that the administration has sort of put in motion in the first year?
And words do have consequences. So if you look at the Jerusalem decision, number one, you had the vote at the United Nations yesterday, 128 countries voting in favor of a resolution that implicitly, the United States wasn't named, but it was a slap at President Trump's decision. 128 in favor, 9 against, 35 abstentions. The Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas says forget about it. Says he won't even talk to the Trump administration right now because the president has made this decision, which for years Jerusalem has been part of final status. Leave that to the end. Let it be settled directly between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But listen to the Prime Minister of Israel here. The Palestinians are mad. They say they won't even entertain conversations about a peace plan right now. Prime Minister Netanyahu says President Trump might be starting a trend.
We're now talking to several countries who are seriously considering now saying exactly the same thing as the United States and moving their embassies to Jerusalem.
Which countries? Or from what continents?
I could tell you that, but I won't because I want it to succeed, and I think there's a good chance it will.
It's interesting there because many people in this town who've worked on this issue for a long time essentially predicted, number one, they weren't getting anywhere with their peace process anyway. They don't see Abbas is not strong enough. Netanyahu, they don't think is interested enough at times. That this is a Trump administration essentially planting the flag with Bibi Netanyahu and saying that's our Israeli-Palestinian policy.
Yeah, I don't think the politics are cut and dry here domestically. I mean, there are people in both parties that support what the...
All in your first month. Lose weight fast. Money back guaranteed.